Hello and welcome back to another episode of You Want to Do What. Today I've got Ben Scott Robinson on, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Small Robot Company. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Daniel. How you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Brilliant.
Let's jump straight in then, Ben. And do you want to tell everyone a bit about what you do?
Yes, I am the co-founder and CEO of Small Robot Company, which is a company set up to use robots and AI to revolutionize farming, basically, to bring a per plant view to the world's largest crops. And so a system that is both more profitable for farmers and also much more environmentally sustainable.
I love this. I've been really excited to get you on because I just find this whole sort of world of evolving the world of agriculture really interesting because it's such a big issue for the world today. And so, how did this even sort of come about, you getting involved in this world?
So getting involved in it, I suppose from a technical and capability perspective, it's something that I've been working towards throughout my career. I've been involved in a fair few startups. A couple of them have even been relatively successful, and but always from a sort of technology perspective, but taking a user experience view. And most recently, I was working for Ordnance Survey. I was lucky enough to be part of their sort of digital innovation team, and they were looking at some amazing things around real-time mapping. So using perpetually flying solar-powered drones and blockchain-based sort of data analysis to create these live maps, like literally maps that are accurate down to minutes or
Wow.
hours rather than months that Google will have. And so all this sort of stuff, the sort of the AI, the robotics, the autonomous vehicles, and all the rest of it was super exciting. But then I just happened to be driving to work very early one day and was listening to Farming Today, which is a radio program on Radio 4, sort of really early in the morning. And there was a guy on there who was talking at a conference called the Oxford Farming Conference. And well, actually, there were two. The first guy was from a big tractor company, and they were talking about the future of farming. And the big tractor company guy was basically saying it's about automation and bigger vehicles and an industrialized process and all this sort of stuff. And then the chap who came on next, who was um, an academic from a university up in the northwest of England, and he came on and said, well, that's not true because these bigger vehicles, these bigger tractors have been happening for the last 20 years, and yet, no more efficiency, no greater yield, no greater, profit has happened for farmers. We've hit a barrier with this, and actually, if you look at the damage that's being done by these vehicles, and the loss of topsoil, and the sort of the variability caused by weather and stuff like this, you're actually losing yields. It's starting to go down rather than go up. And so he argued for using sort of small, precise vehicles and getting a much more granular understanding of the crop, and essentially sort of pointing to robotics, and that just blew me away. It was just
Mm.
this sort of this sort of combination of this sort of left field view that was so obvious, and this incumbent view that didn't really bear any sort of scrutiny when you started to delve into it, and that's kind of my mental sweet spot, I suppose.
So, what's I think you mentioned it earlier, you said a per plant view. What does that actually allow you to do as a farmer that these larger industrial vehicles don't really allow you to do?
So there are two parts really. There's the precision and the size. I'll start with the precision. So when you are gathering information to be at a level that you can see every single plant in the field. So for us, that means using our Tom robot to be able to drive through the fields and sort of take photos and do all sorts of stuff. And you can map those plants. So you can sort of mark a plant and say it's in exactly this location, and you can go back and you can find that plant. You can watch that plant grow. So it's not just this sort of snapshot of something, of a field view. It's actually being able to understand over time how a plant is reacting to its environment, however that's doing. And that is just a completely different scale and level of understanding, to even using sort of computer vision on a tractor or a robot to go out and see what's happening in the field right now. But if you take a step back from that, you see that the tractors that are in field now, they take a per field view. They take a 20-hectare field where there might be 15 million plants in there, and they assume that they're all the same, and they all need the same amount of nutrients. That they all need the same amount of protection from disease. They're all going to suffer from issues with pests at the same time, and it's clearly not true. And as soon as you start delving into it, even when you get down to sort of breaking it down to, dividing a field up into, I don't know how the soils are varied across land, you see that there's massive variations to what those plants need. And when you get down to individual plants, you realize that you're using maybe 95% of the chemicals that you're using in that field are unnecessary. Or
wow, as high as that?
Yeah,
Wow.
or applied at the wrong time. And and all the rest of that stuff just gets washed away, or sort of left to sit in the soil, or over pollutes the plant. And there are huge implications for this in terms of the environment, so what's being washed into the water, the soils themselves, and obviously the food that you eat. So just a very quick example on that, glyphosate, which is a weed killer that's used, and recently has gone in the press because somebody has taken the company who produces them to court for it causing cancer.
Okay.
And glyphosate is used on everything, right? And it's not just used to kill weeds, it's used to dry out crop plants at the end of their life. And this stuff is a desiccant, which means it literally sucks the moisture out of a cell. And it's very effective at doing that, but it doesn't stop when it's done that on a plant. If you eat something which has glyphosate on it and hasn't been cleaned, it will do that to your stomach lining.
Oh my God! Wow.
Yeah, this is what we eat, right? This isn't like sort of a few things. This is a lot of what we eat.
Mm.
So there's a huge consideration on our own health. There's a huge consideration on the environment, and obviously it's just massively wasteful. It's like washing one cup up by filling your bath. So it's that level. So that's the sort of the precision level. And then if you take the vehicles that are doing it, the whole system has been designed on the assumption that we need to be in the field for as little time as possible. So you build as big a machine as possible so you can rush through the fields, because the person who's driving that vehicle, they are the most important thing. And if you can reduce the time that they're in field, then you're doing the right thing. But what happens is you build vehicles which are too heavy really to go on soils. They compact the soil. When they go over the soil, they completely annihilate what's underneath them. Because this compaction, completely stops anything from growing, squishes out all the sort of the air and the water molecules in the soil, stops any, biological life from existing there. And because they're so heavy, if the soil's even slightly wet, they can't go into the field. Which means that if you think about when you plant, with winter wheat crops, you plant in October, the time when it rains the most. And and you're going out in the field applying stuff in March when it's also raining the most. So, the time is really limited, and the bigger the vehicles, the less time they can spend in field. So the bigger the vehicle needs to be to cover the ground even faster. It's a crazy loop. It's a crazy loop which just, is totally self-defeating. So if you take a step back and go, well, what happens if you make something that doesn't need a person, that can be out in field all day, every day if it needs to? And so it can be smaller. And it can be lighter. And because it's lighter, then it doesn't compact the soil. So it's not damaging the soil. It's not causing the same issues. And by not damaging the soil, it means that you have a stronger sort of soil biome. So the plants grow much better. And then when it rains, they can go out and they're not sunk to axles in the mud, because they just go across the mud in the same way that a really, sort of light quad would do, or even you walking across the mud would do. And so, you have a completely reverse cycle. And that, those two things combined, that, the removal of this incredibly heavy vehicle from the soil and all the damages that's doing to the soil. And then at the other end, the removal of all that waste, it just is an absolute no-brainer in terms of changing the system. But because it's so different, and even 5 years ago, it would have been technically impossible to do, it's very hard for people to get their heads around.
Wow. So even 5 years ago, this technology, you couldn't do it?
Well, I think so. The thing that we, the most important, the most fundamental thing to what we do is the GPS system that allows us to be accurate with where we are. That level of accuracy, sort of sub 2 centimeter accuracy that we need, 5 years ago cost £40,000, £50,000 for a unit. We use a unit now which costs round about 1,000.
Wow.
We can get units which cost down to £200.
Wow.
The technology has just gone through the floor. The processing power, we collect 6 to 7 terabytes of data per robot per day, literally larger than life imagery at all sorts of different levels of a 20-hectare field. So it's 20 square kilometers, right?
Wow.
And that data, to process that, to convert that into pictures into actual geospatially referenced points that says this is where this plant is, and then you can work out what type of plant it is and how well it's doing, etc. But just that moving from the photos to that point, requires a processing power which has only really come online with these powerful GPUs that you get for, initially for graphics processing, but now obviously for Bitcoin mining and stuff like that as well. And that really has only been around for the last sort of 5 years at a cost that's acceptable. So those two pieces of technology in their own right, 5 years ago, we could have built what we have now, but instead of costing us, sub £100,000, maybe sort of 50, 60,000 pounds, it would cost us £500,000.
Wow. That is a huge, in just 5 years. It's incredible. But this data that you're creating for these farmers, obviously that has huge range of uses and allows them to perform analytics on their farms. Is that something that you guys are sort of looking into as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing for farmers is not so much the data, it's more what you can do with it. And I think that this has really been a challenge within this marketplace. There have been people who have been collecting data and sort of precision agriculture stuff for quite a long time. But what they've really struggled with is how to convert that into something which is valuable to the farmer. And, and the challenge comes then to, instead of having a pretty map that shows you where a plant's growing well or a plant's not going well, to convert that into instructions for a sprayer to say, well, only spray this patch and not spray this patch. And that sort of changes where the value really lies for the farmer. But the fascinating thing is, once we built the Tom robot and once we got to the level where it was reliable and robust and we could gather the data and, it could go out and sort of trundle around for 8 hours a day and gather this sort of 20 hectares worth of data without causing any stress, we were approached by some of the biggest ag companies in the world, seed companies, nutrient companies, because they're saying, well, we don't have this. On our R&D sites, when we have all these test plots, we don't have a view of every plant in our test plot. And when we're gathering data and finding out which variety of seed we should use, or even basics like how much of the nutrient that we make should be used on the plant. The data that we collect is collected manually or semi-autonomously. It's collected in a different way in different countries, and it's not empiric. So, even for them, they are struggling to be able to use data properly, to be able to guide the decisions in some very fundamental stuff. So, yeah, I think that, it's a real eye-opener to us how valuable this data is, both for the farmers in terms of, the cost of action or inaction, but also to the big corporate companies as well.
It's on the face of it, this sounds incredible. It sounds like you're at the beginning of a huge change, but potentially you can make in this industry and in agriculture across the board. It must be incredibly exciting to be going on this journey.
Oh, it is, and I think that, but it is one of those things that, and I'll say this because my background in user experience design. This technology, there are lots of people who are looking at this technology, who are looking to apply this sort of stuff and are developing technology to allow this sort of stuff to happen. But the key thing is really around finding the need and understanding, where you're bringing something which is valuable to somebody. And I think understanding that, once we've triggered and sort of ticked off the boxes around understanding why this is important and how people will use it and how they will adopt it, that for is almost a bigger deal, because then it's not just something that's in an ivory tower in a lab somewhere, or it's in a test bed in a university, but it's something that can actually be used by real farmers in field, and have real demonstrable benefits for the environment, for sort of sequestering carbon, for providing a field which is not a monoculture, not a green desert, but is actually capable of supporting a biological ecosystem. And I think that for us is the really exciting bit. It's the sort of the scale of the opportunity to deliver good, I guess.
I mean, just listening to you, I'm getting excited. It's an amazing, opportunity you have right here. I mean, it could lead to something potentially where, tell me if I'm wrong, but a farmer could essentially run a farm from some sort of dashboard, and he just clicks the buttons and sends drones out, and he's managing it with data, opposed to having to trundle around fields and kind of a bit of a finger in the air kind of guesstimate as to how much weed killer he needs to put on his farm and things like that.
Yes, basically. I mean, I think that's exactly the case, but almost beyond that. So, in fact, Professor Simon Blackmore, the chap who introduced my business partner and I together, and who came up with this sort of original idea around sort of farming robots. So, when I went up to see him, he expressed the sort of the vision of what he was talking about, which was, he imagined a farmer being able to go out to his robot and press a button on the robot, and the robot would just go out and do that job, the job it was supposed to do all day, and then come back at the end, press a button again, and then the robot would go to sleep. And clearly this is a huge change from the system that's there at the moment. But the first thing that struck my head is, why are you pressing a button?
Yeah.
What the button is completely irrelevant. The button becomes a sort of skeuomorphic, sort of transfer of control. The reality is that sort of stuff, the mundane stuff, what should be done or is currently done on a tractor or a sprayer and going out in field is not where an owner or a manager of a multi-million-pound business should be. Right? They should be thinking about how they can make their farm a better place. How they can make it more sustainable, how they can make it more diverse, how they can sort of bring greater value to it. How they can, instead of growing wheat, they could grow a wheat to then convert into flour to make biscuits or bread or gin. How they can start bringing in regenerative practices, how they can, the stuff that, big thinking stuff that is where a farmer should be. And I think, for us to take away that drudgery, the mundanity, the stuff which requires no thought, and replace the time with thoughts about how to make the farm, the business, the environment better, is really a gift that we can give to the farmers.
I mean, this is all incredibly exciting. But from our point of view, obviously, we like to talk about careers.
Yeah.
Now, having sort of thought about all this massively, it would seem, where and what kind of skills do you think agriculture are going to need in this sort of coming revolution of robots and AI and data?
They're going to need the same skills that the autonomous car industry are going to need. They're going to need the same skills that the sort of quants in merchant banks provide. They're going to need the same skills as digital agencies are going to provide. They're going to require people who get sort of super passionate and geeky about how plants interact with each other, or how bacteria interact with plants. It requires a different level of skill, I suppose, but really broad. And I think this is the really exciting thing from it. So in our company, we have people who are who used to work at Dyson. We have people who used to work at JCB. We have people who used to work at DeepMind. We have people who used to work for Virgin Galactic,
Wow.
and who work for Formula One.
What a roster.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's amazing. And it's, for us, it's lovely because all these people approached us and said, look, I'm doing this thing, but it's not floating my boat anymore. You know, what you're doing is, you know, it's changing the world. How can we get involved? But all these things, you know, all these skills, you know, can come into play. And I think that, you know, the fantastic thing is, because it's such a new space, and this sort of harks back a little bit to the way my own career has gone, that because it's a new space, you don't need to come in with a PhD. You don't need to come in with like a huge amount of experience and 20 years of building farming robots before, because nobody has that. You know, nobody can say, oh yeah, I've done this before with a company. It's a brilliant sort of time where people can come in and go, well, these are my ideas. This is where I make it work. Here's some proof points. Here's how I've put something into play on my own, or how I've done something that's very similar in this industry, and I want to bring it into this because I think it's a really cool thing to do. And that means that it can be a massive confluence of skills, massive diversity of backgrounds, of, you know, of all sorts of reasons, which is really, really exciting. So two other areas, for example, that we've really realized that we just didn't think about. So one was around business planning and business strategy. You know, there's not really been any consistent, coherent thought into how a farm business can, you know, properly strategically diversify. That's not a course. That's not a, you know, that's not a thing. That's something that people learn and pick up, and because they're curious and they want to do it. And, you know, farm management doesn't include, you know, all that innovation or all that diversification or all that sort of stuff. Farm management is about how to run a farm to produce 1 or 2 or 3 crops. And the other one is around service design. So we build, you know, what we do is a service. The robots are part of a service, and that service includes software, the data, the AI, the robots, but also the people, you know, the logistics, the, you know, getting all that sort of stuff together. And in many ways, it's very similar to the way that, I don't know, that DHL works, for example. You know, in that you have this sort of confluence of technology and people that do this incredible thing, or the way that Amazon works. And I think that understanding how to plan and structure and make that work in a really smooth and effective way is a new industry in its own right.
Definitely. And I guess we tend to ask about, you know, what kind of personality traits does somebody need to go into this industry? But from what you've said, I mean, it's going to take a whole different raft of people to make this industry and grow it.
Yeah, completely. Sam, my business partner, is very keen, and has been since we first started working, on a system called Colby A, which is a sort of cognitive analysis system, I suppose, that allows you to understand the sort of things that you enjoy doing most. And that's not subjects, but that's, you know, do you enjoy the sort of the structural or the management or the organization side? Do you enjoy coming up with new ideas? Do you enjoy crafting and making something tangible and real, that sort of thing? And we've applied that heavily across the business because we require this sort of massive variation in people. You know, we need people to be able to come up with crazy new stuff that nobody's ever thought of, but then we also need people to deliver it, and they are not the same people, right? And then similarly, we need, you know, structure and organization and process, but we've got to be super careful about not overloading ourselves with that, because otherwise it becomes a quagmire to try and deliver something. And getting that balance right between people is absolutely fascinating.
You're the second CEO that we've had in this podcast from sort of emerging industries or people trying to change industries that have said exactly that. And it's so refreshing to hear that actually you're looking at the people you're employing, and instead of trying to fit, you know, a square into a triangle hole, you're actually trying to look at the person and go, right, their skill sets are actually this. So we're going to build their job role around those skill sets, which just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, precisely. And aligning, you know, when we have groups of people, you know, how do we align those teams to be, those groups of people to be teams that work really well together, or in some cases conflict? You know, to be able to put in dissonance so that you get these sort of challenging environments where new ideas come out of, where you wouldn't get them if everyone agreed. You know, I don't know, Matthew. Do you know Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking?
No, I haven't heard that one yet.
Absolutely phenomenal book where he talks about all sorts of elements around design. But one of the things he talks about is this, you know, the when you have homogeny of thought, you know, things nearly always go wrong, or
Okay.
things don't work properly. You know, and one of the examples he uses is around, you know, there was a huge project in New York to come up with the first plane, the first heavier than air vehicle. Which employed some of the best people in the world, and engineers and scientists and all the rest of it. But that couldn't make it. They didn't make it. That failed. You know, when two brothers in literally the middle of nowhere did, you know, sort of 2,000 miles away in the centre of the country. And that's kind of proof point. You know, they because they were all going, right, well, that's the idea we go with. Oh, I agree with you, so we do that, even if the idea is wrong. And so, you know, creating that dissonance sometimes and allowing that diversity to be like properly realized is extremely important.
I think recently on the podcast, we've had a few CEOs like yourself who are in emerging industries or industries that are going through rapid change and evolution of technology. And I think it's always important to ask the question of, you know, if somebody's thinking of going into these emerging industries, what's something they should consider, maybe some skill set they should build, because like you say, they're demanding such different skill sets and such varied people and attitudes towards work. Is there something you can do though to help yourself stand out for companies like yourself?
So one of the things that we would love to see more of is people who, you know, really understand the environment that they're coming into, and that understanding doesn't, you know, it's not necessarily a degree or something like that, but, you know, can be picked up through listening to the right podcast, the right information. Just sort of in being immersed in the environment, I think, is really important, and looking for how they fit in within that. So, you know, whether it's problem solving, or whether it's organizational, or whether it's, you know, the craft elements, or, you know, the deep science, or whatever it is, to have that view and understanding, and to show show the willing to be able to get under the skin of it, I think is extremely important. When you're, you know, if you're looking at sort of delivering, you know, being part of it from a technical side, for example, yes, you know, a degree is useful in a roughly analogous space, but just as useful is getting your hands dirty and making something. You know, most of our juniors who have come on board, we've hired because they've done a project which is really interesting, and, you know, they've explored interesting ideas, and they've tried to push the boat out in an interesting way, rather than the quality of their degree, because, you know, the degree is a process that you go through, whereas the projects are nearly always a real reflection of their capabilities and desires. Sorry.
So what's sort of the next 5 years look like for the small robot company? Where's the company going? What's the aims?
So I think the next year or so is very much around a transition to a company that's making its own cash. You know, it's quite basic. We have this capability on the data side, which allows us to be able to find customers who are willing to pay for what we do. And for any startup, you know, you need to move to a point as fast as possible where you're generating revenue. And that's, you know, it's extremely important. However, the vision, you know, but what we can provide and get people to pay for now is such a tiny fraction of the vision, and such a tiny fraction of what we can achieve once, you know, we've sort of developed the infrastructure and the service in place to allow it to happen. That, you know, once we've got to that point, that is almost giving us freedom to operate, to then go out and deliver the rest of the service and the capability. Ultimately, what we want to do is, you know, be at the center of a food ecosystem. You know, we would like it that the end consumer, when they're buying a sandwich, you know, they look at a packet to see that the bread is made in a way which is sequestering carbon and creating biodiversity and supporting the growth of rare sort of meadow plants in field, and all that to be sort of tied together in a brand or an expression which is something like robot grown, where the robot grown is synonymous with an improving ecosystem, a step towards net zero, and a confidence in the future where technology has done the right thing. So I think that that is ultimately where we want to be from a consumer perspective. We want to be recognised. We want to provide value. We want people to say, "I'm willing to pay 5p more for a sandwich for that to happen," and we think that that's very realistic. From a technical perspective, we would love it when you catch a train and you're going past fields, and instead of seeing the sort of the mud, with everything ploughed up and destroyed, and or these sort of like endless rows, the sort of the green desert rows of crops in field, with big tractors going across it, you see slightly scruffier fields, which have different plants growing in there as well as the crop plant. And maybe there's sort of slight buzzing sound going on for what's going on. And instead of those big vehicles, you just see these little robots tootling about doing their job. And when you see them, you don't think anything of it. That's just the way food's grown. Ultimately, that's where we want to be.
Are you finding it a bit of a sort of hearts and minds battle at the moment to get farmers on board, or are you finding them equally excited to embrace new technologies?
No, I think that there are very different mindsets in farmers, and a lot of it is generational. So I'll say older because it's the easy line to draw, but older farmers tend to do what they've always done because they know that works. And if their environment is changing, if they're losing topsoil, if it doesn't work every year, then they're willing to put up with that because that's the change is difficult to take on board. Then you have farmers who are they need to make it work, right? Maybe they're farm managers or it's a smaller farm or whatever, and the bottom line is extremely important. And it's all very well, you see a lot of rich sort of estate owners and people going, "Oh, we're into rewilding, we're doing all that stuff." It's like, well, that's fair enough, and it's really good that some people are doing that, but we still need to produce food, and those people who are producing food do still need to make a profit because they need to feed themselves. So you have that view, and those people who really think like that actually tend to be quite open-minded about how they can make sure they're generating the revenue they need to survive. But you've got to prove the point to them, and you've got to really show that they're the right people. And then you have people who just look at what's happening now and say, "This can't go on." And quite often that's what we call transgenerational farmers. So young in inverted commas, so 30s, 40s, who are taking on their parents' farms or their sort of new managers in the space, and they're taking on new farms, and they're looking at it, and they've got the longest possible view, right? Longest term view. They're looking 20, 30, 40 years into the future because they're looking to see what their kids will inherit. And ultimately, a lot of them are looking at their farms at the moment going, "This farm's not going to be around in that time. It's not going to exist." And so those people are looking for answers, and they're the people who we plug into most at a sort of fundamental level. But the next point for us is to then prove the commercial case, so that the people who just want to make sure they're making a living sort of buy into it. And to be honest, the others, we can wait for them to retire. And the way it's working at the moment, so the way the government is changing the farming subsidies thing is sort of working in our favour, in that the just being paid for owning land isn't good enough anymore. You now have to do things to earn your subsidies. You have to plant hedgerows or have strips where beetles can live, or you have to have wildflower borders, or you have to do all this sort of stuff to get the new ELMS, Environmental Land Management Scheme, money. And the farmers that we're working with are adopting this wholesale and being really, really enthusiastic about it. But there are lots of farmers who are going, "Oh, this is so far beyond what I know that I'm not interested." And the government's actually looking to pay those farmers off and say, "Well, if you don't want to do it anymore, then we will pay for you to no longer farm." And part of me is a bit aggrieved at the fact that, you know, we have to pay people who aren't doing their job very well to step away from the job they're not doing very well. But part of me says, well, it's, you know, we need to do that. As a society, we need to do that. We need to bring on board the fresh blood. We need to, you know, get people who are thinking in the right way about farming for the future.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. I'm genuinely excited when I talk to people like you who are actually making impact and changing the world and affecting an industry that needs change.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Daniel. Much appreciated. It's been an absolute delight coming on, and thank you for taking an interest in my ramblings. And keep it up. I think, you know, what you're doing here is really important. It's important that people can see and look at sort of potential changes in career or where they're going to go, and be, you know, really open-minded about where they're going.
Thank you, Ben. And where can people find you, your company, and what you're up to?
So I'm on LinkedIn, so just look for Ben Scott Robinson, and I always reply. And on Twitter, if you want to find us, it's at Small Robot Co. Or myself, I'm at BCSR. So yeah, generally always up for a chat.
Amazing. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Daniel. Cheers. Bye-bye.